What's up, YouTube? This is the 82 and Old podcast. Welcome back. So, continuing on talking about great teams of the past, I'm talking about the 1989 Detroit Pistons. Now, you got to take a step back and think about the Pistons prior to this. They hadn't really had that much success. For people who don't know, the Pistons have actually been around since the very early part of the NBA. They joined the league in 1948-49 season when the league was still the BAA. But this isn't when the Detroit Pistons were actually formed. You see, they were actually originally formed in 1937, and they were part of the NBL before they were part of the NBA. Now, the NBL was like a predecessor league to the NBA. And they would merge with the BAA. I know it's confusing. And they were called the Fort Wayne Zollner Pistons because Fred Zollner was their owner. And the NBL liked to name their teams after owners. Like, picture that today, like the Steve Jobs Clippers or something. Wait a minute. I said Steve Jobs. I meant to say Steve Ballmer. Whatever. You get what I'm saying. Now, in the NBA, once they joined, and this is why I really like the Pistons. They have a really deep history. Even though they didn't win early on, they had a few finals appearances in 55, 56. But for the most part, they were never a good team, in the 60s and 70s and early 80s. And Isaiah Thomas, many people don't really realize, everybody knows how good of a player he is. But what I think a lot of people don't realize is how good of a player he was prior to 89. He was more of a scorer. Like in 85, he put up 21 points per game and 13.9 assists, 2.3 steals on an elite, for a point guard, 45% shooting. He was a great player. And he was from Chicago, which I'll get into why that's relevant later in this video. So he was drafted to Detroit with the first round, second pick in 1981. And all throughout the early 80s, the Pistons didn't really have this identity quite yet. They were led in scoring by Kelly Tripucka, I think one or two of those seasons. And Kelly Tripucka, he wasn't what the Pistons needed. Yes, he was scoring 26 points per game. But the thing about Kelly Tripucka is he didn't play very much defense. And I think what the Pistons wanted to do with their coach Chuck Daly is switch to a more defensive-minded team. But they would trade him for Adrian Dantley. And Dantley was a really good scorer. He averaged over 30 points per game a few times with the Utah Jazz. But the Pistons, they made it all the way to the finals in 1988. They went 54-28. They were led by Isaiah Thomas, obviously, and Adrian Dantley. Adrian Dantley was the best scorer on that team. I'll get into why Dantley's important in a second. Now, they go to the finals against the Lakers, and there's a very controversial phantom call on Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And Isaiah Thomas had an amazing series. Like in that Game 6, for example, he scored 43 points, grabbed 3 rebounds, dished out 8 assists, grabbed 6 steals, and a block. And I think that's the game. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. I think that's the game where he scored like 25 points just in the fourth quarter. I don't think it was. I think it was one of those games he did. But anyways, the Lakers won Game 7, 108 to 105, and it was a heartbreak. Many people felt the Pistons were cheated, but a lot of people didn't care because the Pistons by this time were building an identity as the bad boys league. They had, young guys like Dennis Rodman, John Sally, tough guys. But Bill Laimbeer was their roughest one, and I'll get into him in a minute. Now, going into the 88-89 season, they needed a change. Adrian Dantley was this great scorer, but he didn't want to give up the ball. He didn't want to pass to his teammates. He didn't want to play into this system, and it was clear they had to trade him. Now, he played 42 games with them in 89, and at the trade deadline, they traded him, and it was a perfect trade for what they needed. They traded him for the humble Mark Aguirre, who would play quite a few seasons after that with the Detroit Pistons. I think he played 5 seasons in total with them. And he was from the Dallas Mavericks, and he himself could score 29 points per game. But he didn't care if he got the points. He would score if he needed to, but he was there to win. So let's talk about this roster, right? Now, Isaiah Thomas was the team's best player, right? And for the 88-89 season, many people feel he got robbed of MVP. He put up 18.2 points per game, 8.3 assists, 1.7 steals. They won 63 games that year. And Isaiah Thomas was a perfect point guard, right? He's a 12-time All-Star, 1985 assist champion, 2-time NBA champion, 5-time All-NBA, 2-time All-Star Game MVP, 1990 Finals MVP. He's on the NBA's 75th anniversary team. He's a great defender, and he's clutch, okay? Don't be fooled when you see that Thomas averaged 18 points per game in a season, all right? He's a pass-first point guard, but if you needed him to, he would take over a game. He had some crazy, crazy handles, right? He could blow by the defenders and drive to the basket easy, And he wasn't the best three-point shooter, but he had a really good mid-range game. Now, in the backcourt with him, you had Joe Dumars. Now, Joe Dumars is one of the most efficient shooters of that day. In the 89 season, I'll stick with talking about 89 because this is the team I'm focusing on. He averaged 48% three-point shooting, 50% field goal shooting, and 85% free throw shooting. Very clutch, right? Solid defender. He's a 5-time All-Defense. And, this backcourt could kill you on defense, right? At the same time, you need them to hit a big shot, they'll do it. Coming off the bench at shooting guard, you had Vinnie Johnson. His nickname was the Microwave. Now, Vinnie Johnson, they called him that because he was an instant offense, right? He would come in like a spark plug and give the team, what they needed. He played 10 seasons with Detroit. And in the 89 season, he averaged 13 points per game off the bench, 3 rebounds, and 3 assists. And he averaged 46% field goal shooting. Now, at the small forward, like I mentioned, they had Mark Aguirre that they acquired from trading away Adrian Dantley. Aguirre was a solid scorer. Great mid-range game. Could drive to the basket. He didn't have the best outside range. That's one thing I want to mention. He wasn't the best three-point shooter. Especially for now, but even back then, he wasn't he wasn't very lethal. You're not going to be scared if he's wide open. I think the best he ever shot was 35% from three, but most of the time he'd shoot like 29, 23, 28, you know, but he was very efficient on offense. He took a lot of smart shots. Now, at the power forwards, you had, John Sally. They called him the Spider. Very long arms. He could block the ball, pretty easily. I wouldn't say he's an all-star caliber player, but he was a good role player. He knew how to play his role. And, they had Rick Mahorn, who's an enforcer, coming off the bench at power forward. Now, Rick Mahorn, unfortunately, he wasn't there for their 1990 championship because the league expansion, he was taken. But he actually made the all-defensive team in 1990. He was a great defender. And in the 88 season, the 89 season, when they won, maybe his numbers don't pop at you. But that's because, he was coming off the bench. He averaged 0.9 blocks, but the following year when he had more minutes, when he made the all-defense team, he averaged 1.4. He was a very capable defender, and he was not afraid to put people on their ass. Now, at the center position, they had Daryl Dawkins, who was a veteran at this point. They had James Edwards, who in 89, he only averaged 7 points per game for them. Now, here's something I think is kind of interesting. He was 33 years old at the time when he was on the Pistons in 89. And, he played 16 minutes per game. But after they lost Rick Mahorn the following season, he played a lot more minutes, James Edwards. And in 89-90, he would play 27 minutes per game. And he would average 14 points per game. And the following year after that, 91, he'd average 13 points. So he was a very capable scorer. I think if you look at the 89 roster, some of these guys like averaging 7 points, you might think, oh, he wasn't a good scorer. And I've even seen this in 2K. The 89 Pistons, they gave him a very low rating. He was a good player. He wasn't washed up. So, also at the center, you had the villain of the 80s, Bill Laimbeer. Laimbeer had actually played his entire career with the Pistons other than his rookie season where he played with Cleveland. And he would get traded to Detroit. Now, he would be a great player today. He's a great stretch big. He could shoot from outside, especially by 89. He was shooting around 36% from the three-point line. And he was a very capable defender. He had 13 rebounds per game in 86. Wasn't the best shot blocker. In 89, he did average 1.2 blocks. And I do want to mention he never made an all-defense team, but he was a good defender. He's a 4-time All-Star. You could not afford to leave him open on three. Now, Dennis Rodman. I saved him for last because I really like Dennis Rodman. 8-time All-Defense, 7-time rebounding champion, 2-time Defensive Player of the Year. Now, in 89, he wasn't quite what he became later with the Pistons and the Bulls. He averaged 9 rebounds per game, and he played 26 minutes per game. And I'm surprised they didn't give him 6th Man of the Year, because he was a very vital role coming off the bench. And the thing about Rodman, yes, he was not offensively sound, but he gave you so much more. Some of the stuff you don't see on a box score. He never averaged more than 1 or one block per game or one steal per game. That sounds crazy because we know how good of a defender he is. But he let's just say he was capable at this point in his career of guarding the 1 through the 5. He could guard any position, and I mean that. So this team was on a revenge tour. They went 63-19. They were coached by the legendary Chuck Daly. Now, in the first round, they defeated the Boston Celtics, who were beat up. The Larry Bird, the Kevin McHale. I think their playoff run doesn't get talked about enough, this Pistons team. I'll tell you why in a second. They defeated the Celtics, like I said. Second round, they faced the Milwaukee Bucks, who were one of the best teams in the late 80s. I mean, by this time, they weren't quite what they were in the mid-80s, but they were a great team. Terry Cummings, Jack Sigma, Ricky Pierce, etc. But the thing is, too, about this Pistons team, in the conference finals, they had a rival that was coming up, the Chicago Bulls. Now, the Bulls at this time, Michael Jordan wasn't what he was in the 90s. Okay, he wasn't a consensus greatest player of all time yet. He wasn't, he did have an MVP award. I think he won in 88. But he wasn't at the level of a Bird or a Magic yet. Okay, now, the Pistons and him had a rivalry because in 88, 89, 90, 91, they faced each other in the playoffs. And eventually the Bulls would dethrone them, but they were this up-and-coming team. And in that conference finals, Jordan averaged 29 points, 5 rebounds, 6.5 assists, 2.0 steals. But the Pistons beat them in 6, and they advanced to the finals. Now, in the finals, they swept the Lakers from the year prior, their rival. Now, I do want to note, because I know somebody's going to get on my ass if I don't mention this, Magic Johnson did not play in that series. He was injured. And some people will say the Lakers would have won. I don't know. Injuries are part of the game. I will never put an asterisk on a team because of injuries. I'm sorry. That's part of the game. That's a factor. The Lakers themselves went 57-25. And they were undefeated in the playoffs going into that series. They were good, okay? Magic was at the height of his powers. But nonetheless, the Pistons corrected their wrongs from the year prior, and they defeated the Lakers 4-0. And Isaiah Thomas was officially a champion. The Detroit Pistons were officially a champion. They never won prior to this. This is their first title, and they would repeat the following year. But this is just a topic about the 89 Pistons. And I think they're one of the most forgotten great defensive teams in NBA history. I know recently they've kind of been brought up again because of that Last Dance documentary. But this 89 Pistons team, in my eyes, are in the top 10 conversation of teams of all time. For any era. I think what hurts them is maybe their reputation, because the way a lot of these players played on this Pistons team, Bill Laimbeer especially, Rick Mahorn, Rodman, they were pretty dirty players, and a lot of people hated the Pistons during that time. So when you're a hated team, people aren't quick to remember you for the good you do. And I think the Pistons really resent the Bulls. And I think it's wrong when people say the Bulls only won because the Pistons got old in 91. That's not true. The Pistons weren't that old of a team in 91. It's just they started struggling with injuries. I mean, Joe Dumars was only 27. Isaiah Thomas was 29. Rodman was 29. I mean, yes, Vinnie Johnson was 34, James Edward was 35, but they still had their core pretty young. They weren't that much older than the Bulls. I mean, if I remember right, Jordan was 27, Pippen was 25. So that's not true. But, I think the Pistons hold some kind of a resentment, especially when they walked off, when the Bulls dethroned them and defeated them in Game 4 of the 91 Eastern Conference Finals. And I think even to this day, Isaiah Thomas holds a grudge against Jordan. But you can't take anything away from the 89 Pistons. They're one of the greatest teams of all time. Where do you rank the 89 Pistons in terms of greatest teams of all time? Thanks for watching. Subscribe, like, comment down below. I appreciate it.